Ladies and gentlemen, here we are in the next installment of England versus France, the Hundred Years' War. The deal is that we've been talking a lot about how England and France and all their various forms have usually been in some kind of angst against each other, and that is largely because England and France have a long history of invading each other. We have of course, the Normans invading England on one side, and then we've got the English during things like King Richard the First and John, and we go forward with the Edwards invading France, to maintain or hold on to lands there. And the ruling family of France never really liked the idea of the English being in France, but they sometimes had to make deals with England to keep, war from happening and the whole deal. It's just kind of a problem. And while England often has a king that rules the whole country, France is a huge country. And during the Middle Ages, France often had a lot of very powerful nobles, like people like the Duke William of Normandy from the past, who had so much power that kings had a hard time controlling them. So really, France was kingdom by committee, whereas England could be kingdom by kingdom, and by kingdom's sake, following the king. And that meant that France had a hard time answering invasions and that sort of thing. Okay, so that leads us to the story. How do we end up with this thing called the Hundred Years' War? Well, the deal is that we're talking about 1337 to 1453. This war goes on off and on for 116 years. Sometimes they were breaks, okay? This began as a dispute, as they always do, over who was the rightful king of one of the kingdoms involved, which was France. There were lots of wars over this kind of thing over European history, over the idea of who gets to be the ruler of some territory somewhere. That's a very common reason for people to fight. And in fact, I would argue that no matter what the trappings are, almost every time, whether people say it's because of religion or pride or whatever, the reality is that war is almost always over real estate and money. Every time. Okay. So this whole thing is fought in France entirely, but remember there are English lands in France, and so they're involved in this. By the end of the war, of the Hundred Years' War, there's going to be a shift, or there's a shift during the war that causes this to happen. We start to emerge into a modern military system in Europe that didn't exist before. Under the feudal system, armies were temporary. They were maybe 2 or 3 month long conscriptions that you had a king that said, we must go to war. And so sometime during the spring through the fall, the king could raise up an army for about 3 months at the most. Because if you took your armies with you for too long, those people who are in your army aren't at home farming. And you kind of need them at home farming because otherwise you don't have enough food to get through the winter, right? And so the deal is that kings in feudal Europe could raise armies. They call upon their vassals, their barons and their dukes and their knights to come and fight with them. And those barons, dukes, and knights bring about a third of their peasants with them, and they all go out and they fight for 2 or 3 months, and then they have to go home. Well, what happens is by the end of the Hundred Years' War, England and France, and then others will follow, are going to actually have standing professional armies year-round, 24 hours a day, 12 months a year, standing professional armies. And that's not something that's happened before in Western Europe. And this means that the end of the Hundred Years' War signals a shift. There's also new types of weapons that come into play, okay, which is going to involve, as you see in the pictures, longbows. There's also at the end of it going to be cannons, all right, that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot of changes that happen as a result of this long war. What are the causes of the war? There's several of them, okay? One of the controversies, of course, as we mentioned before, who gets to rule France when the French king dies, and the status of the French lands that belong to an English king. Remember that England, since Duke William, back in 1066, and we're talking about the 1300s now, there has always been land since Duke William that in France that belongs to England through marriage and hereditariness and all that stuff. So King John back in the 1200s had lost most of that land to the French, but the English under Edward I, II, and III had been slowly gaining a little bit of it back. And this is an opportunity, this moment, the Hundred Years' War, is an opportunity for the French king and the English king to fight it out to see who gets all that land. Do the English continue to hold on to some of it, or can the French take it all over? What happens? And so this is supposed to be the war to end the decision. Who gets to rule France, or any part of France, England or France? That's really the deal. Flanders is an issue. I'll show you a map that has Flanders in it in a little bit. But Flanders is this country that's just north of France at the time, and Flanders was a wool production state. So if you needed wool, and everybody needed wool, because that was the main form of cloth at the time, was wool from sheep, you would usually be doing business with Flanders. And so Flanders was actually extremely important to people because you needed that wool production. And England and France will fight over control of Flanders as well. And finally, as we move forward with a 100-year war, you cannot come out of a war of 100 years long without having deep nationalistic sympathies. Will France be a stronger nation at the end of it? Will England be a stronger nation at the end of it? How much will people be prideful of what nation they're from based on the results of the war and so on and so forth? Nationalism, right? So here we are at the controversy of succession, which is a big part of why kingdoms have always fought historically when it comes to trying to decide who gets to be the next king or queen of a kingdom. Usually there is political battles within a family. Sometimes there's war, like a civil war between members of a family to see who gets to be the next ruler. And when it gets confusing, such as when multiple kingdoms are involved because of marriage between different royal families of different kingdoms producing offspring that might have a claim, then you might have actual full-blown wars. The 100 Years' War in England is going to start because of one of these. And there's a bunch of wars that happen in Europe throughout European history way into the modern era as a result of arguing over who gets to be the next ruler of some kingdom or another. It's a common reason for why kingdoms will fight each other when it comes to hereditary rule. So let's take a look at this one. I'll try to make, when you look at this slide, it probably creates a little bit of panic. Don't worry, I'll bring you through it here. So Kings of France, this whole side, Kings of France right here, okay? Philip IV, who was alive at the same time as Edward II of England. These two fought each other a bit, and we'll talk more about them in a second. But Philip IV, his bloodline is going to go to, meaning the one that rules after Philip IV, goes to his eldest son. His first eldest son, Louis X, dies so quickly that he was ill, so he's not going to be the next king. He's not going to be the successor, all right? The next youngest son, Philip V, okay, he is going to be the next king because he's the next eldest kid of Philip IV, all right? Then we have Charles IV, who is the third eldest, and Charles, meaning of the male heirs. It's always a male line of succession is always preferable to female. That's just because, men and patriarchies. So we have Louis X cannot become king. All right. Nor can his son because, they both died very much close to each other. Philip IV, his eldest kid that survives is Philip V. He becomes king after Philip IV dies in 1314. And then once Philip V dies in 1322, the next person to become king would be Charles IV, except guess what? He died in 1322, the same year that Philip V did. I'll let you look that stuff up as to why they all died at certain unique times like that, but that's just what happened, all right? Charles IV dies, so he can't become the king. So the only surviving male heir of the Philip IV line, of the Valois line, right, is this guy named Philip VI. And here he is. He's young. 1328 to 1350 is this kind of time frame. But here's the problem. Here's where we get to the rub of who gets to be the next ruler. When all these guys are dead, and Philip V is dead, and Charles IV is dead, and Louis X is dead, the next eldest member of the immediate family of Philip IV is Isabella, Princess of France. She was married to Edward II, who, he's the reigning king of England at the time. Because she's married to Edward II, their offspring is really the eldest member of the bloodline between all the different kids that are related to the French king, the original French king that starts the controversy in the line of succession. So Philip IV dies, the crown goes to his next eldest that was alive at that time, Philip V. He dies, and then the crown goes to who? Well, if it technically goes to the eldest member of the family, it would go to Isabella, and if it has to be a male heir, then the eldest male heir would be Edward III. Because he was born before Philip VI. So technically, Edward III should be the next king of England. because he was born to the line of French monarchists, all right, all the way down from Isabella down. It's just that the French were kind of like, but wait a minute, if Edward III becomes the King of England, then basically we're being ruled by, the King of England who we hate, and he's going to be in charge of our entire kingdom, and we can't have this. And so the French nobility got together and said, screw it, we're going to put Philip VI in charge, who is younger and technically less pure as far as the hereditary nature of lineage goes. Technically, Edward III was the eldest, most direct line of blood coming from Philip IV. But Philip VI was all French. Right? He was all French, and there was no female in the middle of that lineage getting down to him. So the deal is that the French are just going to say, well, the crown can't pass through the female members of the family. That's a rule that the French will make up just for this, and then they'll give the crown to good old Philip VI. And when that happens, Edward III, when he becomes King of England, is going to say, that was unfair. I shall have to fight a war to get this crown because it's really mine. And that becomes the justification for invasion of France by England, which starts off the 100 Years' War. Nobody expected it to go 100 years, but that's how it started. Philip VI, as we said, is going to be the one that is crowned the King of France, even though technically it should have been. Should have been the King of England becoming the King of France through marriage. All right. Basically, the reason why this happens is that the French made up a new rule, and the new rule was that the crown of France could not pass through the female line. That's the rule that the French create, and because they create that rule, that patriarchal, I can't even say that rule, Edward cannot become the King of France through his wife Isabella. So that's what happens. That's how they basically technicality'd Edward III out of becoming the King of France, which would have made him really happy because power. So there's a couple things that are going to happen. And then in 1340, remember this guy, Philip VI, becomes the king in 1328 by the approval of the nobles of France. Well, in 1340 is when Edward III will declare himself the King of France and start getting ready for war. The reason why he waited until 1340 is he needed some excuses before he could get the people of England to agree to a war for this, okay? So here are the things that happened that caused Edward to say, I am going to name myself king and go to war. Well, in 1337, Philip VI started attacking English territory in France, whatever was left, and Philip did this while Edward's armies were fighting the Scots. So Philip, the King of France, saw Edward's being involved with fighting the Scots as a good opportunity to take back some French territory that still existed under English rule on the coastline of France. And so that really angers Edward III, but he's got to deal with the Scots first, and he does. Okay, which is basically he fights, he loses, and he has to give Scotland its independence, at least for a little while. Thanks to guys like this scary-looking dude right here. Okay, thank you, Mel Gibson. Also, Flanders. Here's the map I promised. Whoops. Right here, Flanders. This is where Flanders used to be. Now it's basically Belgium. All right. But here's where Flanders used to be. And Flanders was this major production house of wool, really high quality wool cloth. It still is, actually. And so the deal is that France is going to start making, under Philip VI, is going to start making kind of, a foray towards Flanders. It looks like maybe France might try to invade and take over Flanders, or at least try to limit Flanders' trade to France only, and that France might try to block Flanders from trading with England. Either way, it would be bad for Flanders for France to have control over Flanders. So Flanders is going to ask England for help. Hey, England, France is screwing with us. Would you please protect us? We need your help. And so Edward has a couple of reasons to invade France. One, the French throne, he thinks, should be his through marriage. Two, Flanders has asked for help. Okay. And three, France is attacking English territory along the coastline. Okay, so those are the three reasons that England is going to go to war, and we have this nuclear option here, which is to go to war with France, and this war is going to go on and on and on and on. Each side, again, it doesn't go every year for the 116 years of this war happens. It just goes for a couple years, and then there's a pause of several years, and then there's another invasion and some fighting, and then another and another, and it goes on this whole time. So each side would raid enemy territory. Remember, there are English lands in France, so when the French want to go fight the English, they just have to go to the English lands in France, as opposed to going to England itself, which is why this works out, okay, for them. So each side are basically raiding each other's territory over the course of 100 years. France has a huge population, 16 million people, okay? So 16 million people is far bigger by about 10 million than what England had at the time. And French armies were larger and better armed than the English and armored, all right? And the Kingdom of France was very wealthy. So the deal is that the English could not carry on sustained combat with the nobility of France, because France's nobility was extremely well set up for this kind of thing. The French had been fighting with other Europeans for quite a long time, and with each other, and the French had developed one of the best militaries in all of Europe by this point, by the 1350s. It's just that something's going to happen, you might recall, that's going to suddenly throw France into chaos, and it'll throw England into chaos for a while, but England recovers faster. What is that, you say? Well, it's going to be the Black Plague, right? That's going to move in, and it's going to throw France into chaos. But before that, I just want you to see this stuff. The English, they don't have nearly as many well-armored troops as the French have, knights on horseback. And knights on horseback is the background of the French noble system. And these guys, by the time we get into this war, these guys are wearing full plate armor, and they can afford it. This image right here of this knight on this horse that's armored, this war horse, this is looking at somewhere in excess of about $200,000 of equipment right here, and a guy with a whole lot of training, all right? This has a lot of equipment. This was very expensive, and France could field 40 to 50,000 of these people at one time, along with their foot troops, along with their men-at-arms, along with crossbowmen, okay? So the French, just attacking the French seemed ridiculous. It's just that, unfortunately for the French, they were not very well organized. Okay, so England invading France was never going to be a full conquest of France, but it was going to be a fight to maintain control of English territory. Even though it started with Edward trying to conquer France, it's not going to happen. Edward can't field a big enough army to defeat all of France. There's no way to do it. So that brings us to the strengths of England, okay? England may not have as many people, but they have the longbow, and we'll talk a bit about why that matters. Okay, the English, being a smaller country, has a more unified nobility, whereas the French have a very disparate nobility, lots of very powerful people who may or may not do what the king says, the French king says, okay? The English are very experienced at this point from long war against the Scots and the Welsh, and there are some successful strategies. The English did not fight battles at this point in time for pride. They fought only when they knew they could win a battle. That was very important to them. And the English have the opportunity to destabilize France because they wait until a plague hits and then start invading. And they're going to be raiding the French countryside, destroying farms and territory, raiding people there, the whole thing, to the point where the French have a hard time coming back at the English during these raids, during these attacks. So I'm going to show you a short video on how a longbow works. I just notes up here, that a longbow can fire a steel-tipped arrow 200 yards away. And although sometimes arrows can bounce off of the armor that the French knights wore, that solid plate armor, if it hit directly, it could go right through that armor, because these cloth yard arrows were actually pretty heavy for when they had the mass behind them flying through the air. And these are people, these guys shooting these things have trained their whole lives to do this. There was a rule in England that starting at around the age 5, you started learning how to shoot longbows. And so, and there were tournaments just for longbows, longbow tourneys, just to help encourage people to learn how to do these things. There was an industry where every family had to make a certain amount of arrows per year and deliver those to the crown, to the King of England. And there were people who had very well-paying jobs just making bows. So England is well armed with bows, but not necessarily well armored with a lot of plate armor on a lot of knights. Okay, that's kind of an issue. It's just that these things could fire real fast and they were real deadly, and the French had nothing like this. They could get crossbows from Italy, crossbowmen that they could hire from Genoa, Italy, the French could, but crossbows were not nearly as fast or as deadly as longbows were. And so this one piece of technology alone is really going to do some damage. Here's a video.
Well, what we got here is your longbow. It's a very simple weapon, made famous during the 100 Years' War, the 14th and the 15th century. It's a very simple thing. It's the heart and the sapwood, the inside and the outside of the yew tree from the tree trunk. The string, it's just linen string, piece of cow horn on each end, and yet you have a weapon that can shoot one of these well over 300 paces. But look at the arrow. It has a barbed point, it's called a broadhead. Once it's inside your body, you can't pull it out. The arrow shaft, wooden, it's from the ash. Goose feathers, these are called the fletchings. In fact, the man who makes the bow is called the bowyer. The man who makes the arrow, the fletcher. The man who makes the arrow point, the arrowsmith. The man who makes the string fellow. It's all a family business. But once you put the whole thing together, you've got a murder weapon. See what makes it so deadly? You can shoot fast. The wounds at the other end, incredibly painful. Let me show you how simple it is. You put the arrow on, you look at the target, you bring him back and simply let him go. You had to train by law, at least from the age of 7. You'd shoot for 2 hours after church every Sunday. It changes your muscle shape. Your one shoulder on the right thickens, your right forearm becomes stronger. He would stand there, pouring the arrows down, until he felt as if his arms were breaking. The thing about it is, because you train so much, you don't actually look down the arrow. You're looking at the target all of the time. You fix yourself on to that man. Fast, accurate, and under power. But it was all down to simply this: being able to look at your enemy and put him down.
Comparing the armies a little bit for you, and then we'll just go through what happens, all right? The French will maintain the feudal tradition of requiring their vassals, their knights, to devote 40 days a year to military service. And that means, you got all these well-armed knights. That the problem with this system, the feudal system, when it comes to this kind of fighting for 100 years, is that from year to year, you can only get so many knights to serve because they might have already served their 40 days that year. So the deal is that you could never get the entire French army out there at one time. You can only get parts of it that were available to come and fight. So the French never fielded this giant force. They could field up to 40 to 60,000 troops at one time, which is a lot. It's a lot of people, but the French army is much bigger than that. It's just that they were all home farming or on break, during the rest of the fighting that happened from time to time during the 100 Years' War. The English are going to create a modern contract army where they simply pay people to join them for as long as the army is in the field. And these professional soldiers, longbowmen and swordsmen, are going to join in for their own profit. Whatever French territory they capture, they get to raid and split up the money, the wealth from it, to make themselves rich. English entrepreneurs can capture in battle French nobles and sell them back to their families. That made people a lot of money, made people rich in England if you were a foot soldier that managed to capture a French knight, right? So these things happened a lot. And these peasant longbow, just peasants, are going to be the ones that are going to help the English defeat the French over and over and over and over. And it's this idea, the idea of splitting the spoils of war, that help to pay these soldiers who come and fight. It's kind of like a commission, where if you are in the English army, and you beat the French, you get a commission. You get to basically, split up the proceeds of what you won that you captured from the other army. So the first real big battle that happens in this war, this is directly after the Black Plague kind of starts moving in, and the French are reeling, are unable to really come at the English who invade. It's 1346. Battle of Crécy, and this is the first fight that the English really fight in under the orders of Edward III. Excuse me. Okay, so we've got 9,000, just 9,000 troops, 9,000 professional soldiers under the command of the English, and you've got 30,000 French troops. Okay, so 30,000 knights. All right, these are highly armored people. 30,000 knights on horseback versus 9,000, some on horse, some on foot. What's going to happen? All right. Well, Edward III does his thing. He picks the terrain and picks a battle, ground that he knows he can win if things go his way. And he waits for the French to show up, who take a long time to show up because, like I said, it's hard to get these guys to serve, or the French to serve, because they only can serve 40 days per year, and they have to be contracted to come and fight for that 40 days, and you have to really weigh this stuff out. And two, they're spread out all throughout the country of France, so it takes time to get them to show up. And three, well, they're having trouble from the plague that's hurting them way more than it's hurting the English. Okay, so that's where we're at. Wave after wave of French cavalry are going to charge at the English, and wave after wave, when the battle starts, are going to be cut down by the 5,500 longbowmen that are going to be firing an arrow every few seconds at the French knights. And those arrows will hit the horses, and those arrows will hit the men, and the French knights are going to fall, and they're going to be stuck in the mud, and they're going to be unable to fight against just this heavy artillery. To a certain extent, this is a little bit at the very beginning of World War I. There were a number of English nobles. I know this is World War I, but they were still English nobles at the time, who were cavalry officers. They were people that were fighting like they were fighting the Boer Wars or something. And so they're dressed in their tan fatigues and stuff, and they've got their pith helmets on, some of them, and the whole thing. And these English charge into the Verdun forest. These English nobles on horseback charge with their sabers waving and their carbines firing, and they're charging at German machine gunners who are in pillboxes, and the Germans couldn't believe the English were doing this, but it's just what the English did. That's what they were used to at the beginning of the war. And so there's a cavalry charge going up against German machine gunners at the very beginning of World War I. And that sort of thing is what changes a nation, when they suddenly realize that their tactics are ancient tactics and they don't work anymore. And so here we are in 1346, where you've got 5,500 peasants firing longbows, like 100-pound or so longbows, at French knights. And those French knights are used to being battle tanks that can't be hurt by anything. And they're being hurt by yard-long arrows that are punching through their armor. It's a complete upset. The French were not ready for this. So the French are mowed down by these longbowmen. So right here, you've got Edward III's army, and he balances himself well. There's the town here, there's some buildings here, there's some forests on the sides, so the French can't go around and attack from the rear. That's very important. And so what you have are Philip's troops coming this way, and they've got crossbowmen, Genoese crossbowmen. The problem with these hired, very expensive Genoese crossbowmen, because you guys, the French in 1346 did not believe in training their own archers, because the French were used to their knights doing all the work for glory and honor. And so they actually hired all these poor Genoese crossbowmen from Italy, from Genoa, Italy, and they all come in and they're thrown out into the front. And the job of the Genoese crossbowmen with their crossbows is to fire their bolts at the front of the English lines. But the longbows could fire further. So the longbows make short work of the Genoese crossbowmen, and the French have no other way to win this battle except to actually charge their knights at the English, and the knights just get mowed down by all those arrows. Hundreds of thousands of arrows flying from English longbows. So what are the results of this? 300 English will die in this battle. 10,000 French will die in this battle, and many are captured as well. Nobles are annihilated. These are nobles who can't go back home to run their lands, and the French king and the families there have to actually find new people to run things. So it throws France into complete and utter chaos for a while. All right, there died that day the finest flower of French chivalry, the Battle of Crécy. Edward III is going to go forth then, and he's going to take the city of Calais, which the English will hold on to for a very long time, by the way. All right. There's a little video just showing you where the battle happened, Cressy, and then Edward III goes and takes the port city of Calais. So now, under Edward III, this territory has been taken, but the French aren't ready to give up. Okay, the French have taken all their country back at this point, and the English have to get it back from the French through battle if they want it. So here we are. What's going to happen? The Black Plague hits 1347. A wave of Black Plague starts sweeping through Europe. You can see kind of where it goes. So there's going to be a pause in fighting in 1347 because, people are dying like crazy from a disease. You see where the plague is coming from, out here from Asia, coming along the trade routes, and then all the way up into Scandinavia, hitting England as well. So because about a half or so of the population of Europe is going to die, all the various wars that different European nations were having basically go on pause for a couple of years. Until 1356. It's about 6 years later. It's time for another attempt. The English have recovered, the French not so much. So there's going to be another English army coming into a place called Poitiers in 1356. And the English are going to win another major battle, which was led by Edward the Black Prince. We've heard of him before in the last lecture. And so Edward's son, the Black Prince, is going to attack and kill. So longbowmen, again, are instrumental in the victory. The French have learned nothing. And so here's what's happening. English holdings are now increasing again. From Poitiers and Cressy, all the way, in Calais, all the way down into here and down here into Gascony. So, and here's Cressy, the Battle of Cressy and Calais, which means Flanders is being influenced by the English like Flanders wanted. So the English have important strategic territory here, and the English are defending their territory here. So Edward III may not be the king of all France, but Edward III has won for himself the rule of hereditary English territory ever since King John lost all this stuff back in the Robin Hood period. Okay, so this is what we're looking at, is some actual wins by the English to take over portions of France that they used to own a couple hundred years before. So what are some things that Richard II is going to do to really help improve England's nationalism as they continuously fight France? Well, the Order of the Garter, here's what it is. It's just this garter. A garter is a type of belt that you put around your calf or your thigh. That's all it is. And usually you would wear them to hold socks up, like big long socks, or hoses, hosen. And so the garter is something that people could, decorate and put symbols on them, such as, look, I'm a Knight of the Garter because the king gave me this particular belt that's around my thigh or my calf. And so there's this symbol. Edward III and Richard II, as they move forward, create this very prestigious honor. If you are created a Knight of the Garter, it means you fought well against the French military, okay? And then they're going to start to get into this idea of St. George and the Dragon as being the patron saint of the Knights of the Garter who go forth to fight the French. Again, this is nationalism. It's propaganda, okay? So, not family connections, can you join the Knight of the Garter only by merit on the battlefield. So if you wanted to be seen as a really awesome knight, you had to become a knight because you fought on the battlefield. And these are all modeled after old symbols, right? The idea of the Round Table of Arthur and St. George and the Dragon, which is this patron saint of the English, all this stuff, right? St. George is this somewhat mythical knight of England, embodying the ideals that the English put for this guy named St. George, famous for killing some dragon somewhere that we've never heard of. All right, so St. George, saint of the English royal family, and this is the flag of England at the time of the beginning decade of the 100 Years' War, the cross on a white field. The English flag still has this. It's still there. It's just that there's lots of other things on it too. Okay, but this is the first real new flag of England since the old days, and that means nationalism, right? You are knights that fight for England under St. George and the King, and these new symbols of nationalism created by Edward III and Richard II. So let's jump forward to the 1370s. France starts to kick some butt. Notice that? Let me do that again. Watch that map. France starts to actually take back territory from the English. So between 1369 and 1395. So that means that at some point, the English are going to have to go back in and take that territory back, right? So again, this is a 100 Years' War. This is just the next thing that's going to happen. Well, in the 1380s, there was another wave of Black Plague that had come through. And so peasants were revolting and they were trying to, the wages were going up, as we mentioned before the last lecture. Wages were going up for the remaining labor in England, and the nobles were trying to kind of stop the general peasant labor from getting too powerful. And there's going to be this revolt that happens. So the English are unable to defend their territory because they're busy fighting their own people. They're basically in a civil war up in England. And while that civil war is happening, the French take back territory. Okay, so 1381, there's a peasant revolt. The legacy of Richard II isn't going to be let's go and invade France as much as let's keep England from going into a full-blown civil war, and let's find a way to restructure England to work in this new era where we have fewer people in England thanks to the plagues, and therefore we have to restructure what they do and how they're paid and everything else. Okay. So eventually, negotiations and massacres, and the revolt is put down. England has to recover from this period. So it's 1381. It's going to be a while before England can go back into France and fight. So finally, Richard II is going to actually leave. He's going to abdicate or retire, if you will, in 1399. So who's going to become the next king? Who's going to do something maybe to basically bring back the symbol of English power against the French? Henry IV, all right? Henry IV, King of England, first of the house of something called Lancaster. Not Lannister, you Game of Thrones people, Lancaster. The Lancaster family is going to be very important later. All right, so the Lancaster family is now a family that will rule England for a while, starting with Henry IV. So he's going to not raise taxes. He keeps the nobility happy, all right, by doing so. That also means that he doesn't have a ton of money. Okay, so fighting wars in France is going to be hard for him to do because he's not raising taxes. Therefore, he's going to negotiate a truce with France. So France has almost gained back all their territory in France now, except for Calais and some of the coastal parts of Aquitaine. And that's it. So is that it? Is the war over? Oh, this lecture can finally end. Just kidding. Henry V, if you've heard of him through Shakespeare, Henry V, ladies and gentlemen. He's going to become the next King of England after Henry IV. And guess what Henry V's going to do? Revival of English nationalism, invasions of France. King of England from 1412 to 1422, a military dude. He's been fighting a lot during his time, and he is going to say, you remember Edward III who said he should have been King of England? I agree with that from some years ago, and I'm gonna go ahead and invade France because it's true. I believe we should be the kings of France. So let's go. Of course, Shakespeare has shown how much Henry V was venerated. He was a bloodthirsty monster, okay, Henry V. But regardless of that, Henry V was known as a really great military guy that brought the pride of English feats of arms back to England, brought a lot of nationalist pride back to England after having a couple of kings that were not good at that, Richard II and Henry IV. So here he comes. Now, I'm going to play this in 1 second, the St. Christmas Day speech, because you can't talk about the 100 Years' War and not hear the way the English think about the Battle of Agincourt through Shakespeare's words today. You just can't do that. So let me talk about the Battle of Agincourt, or at least introduce it and tell you why the English were kind of scared at this point. And I'm just going to tell you that there was this huge battle where Henry V had been fighting in France for a while, and the French were finally sending a massive force to stop him. And the French should have won, but they did not. It's kind of a copy of the earlier battles of the 100 Years' War, Crécy and Poitiers. The Battle of Agincourt is very similar, except that the French had even more knights coming, and those French knights, despite the English longbows, should have won. The English army was tiny against the French army that was finally going to end Henry V's reign of terror in France. Well, let me just play you the little video of the Battle of Agincourt so that you understand what the English were up against when they unexpectedly won this battle. And then and then I'll play you the St. Crispin's Day speech to show you why that was so important. The idea of trying to tell your people, we're going to go forth and die for England because there's no way we can win. And then all these guys go forth, a 5,000 man army, and they defeat like 50,000 knights, all right, of France. How does that go? So here is the video of the Battle of Agincourt.
I want to draw your attention to a turning point in history. I believe that from a purely military perspective, it signaled the end of the medieval era. It brought into focus some of the trends that were beginning to emerge that would continue for the next 500 years. This turning point was the Battle of Agincourt on October 25th, 1415. This battle was a small part of the 100 Years' War between England and France. King Henry V of England had invaded with a small army and some unrealistic goals. After a few months of campaigning and some very modest success, he resolved to head for English Calais and then back across the Channel. As the English approached Calais, the French army finally caught up with them and pursued them north. By this point, the English were exhausted, and the French easily overtook them, placing themselves between the English army and the coast. The English were now cut off, stuck in enemy territory with winter fast approaching. This was a bad position, which was just going to deteriorate with every passing day. Let's take a moment to look at the relative strength of these two armies. The French army had around 2,400 cavalry, 7,600 heavy infantry, 4,000 archers, and 1,500 crossbowmen. The English army had no cavalry, 1,000 heavy infantry, 5,000 archers, and no crossbowmen. Let me just say here that these numbers are hotly debated. I spent some time looking into some of the various arguments, and in my opinion, these numbers make the most sense. But take that with a grain of salt. Historians who have devoted their entire careers to this subject have, in a way, thrown up their hands in frustration. This is what we know with certainty. We know what kinds of troops made up each army, and we know that the English were significantly outnumbered. So, the English and the French squared off across a muddy field. This field was flanked on both sides by tree lines. The English were to the south, English territory was to the north, and between them stood the French. The French arrayed themselves in 3 lines of battle. The lines were mixed, but most of their cavalry was placed forward on the wings, while most of their archers were held back in the 3rd line. The English, being outnumbered, arrayed themselves in 1 line. They placed all of their heavy infantry in the middle, with archers on the wings. They also concealed some archers in the woods, on both sides of the field. The archers all deployed defensive wooden stakes in front of them, which were supposed to deter any direct charge and funnel enemies towards the heavy infantry in the middle. They were otherwise undefended. The English had an unusual problem. Look at the makeup of this army. It's idiotic, right? They didn't do this on purpose. At the beginning of the campaign, the army was double this size, with normal proportions, but casualties and attrition left them with this lopsided arrangement. So the two armies formed up. Neither wanted to make the first move. For the French, they had several thousand men who had fallen behind during a march. These men would be trickling in over the next few days. Plus, they were well supplied, they could afford to wait. For the English, they had created this little makeshift defensive position for themselves that they didn't want to leave. But some accounts say that the English were out of food, which put a ticking clock on their situation. After a lengthy standoff, the English moved first. Their archers dismantled their defensive wooden stakes and carried them forward as the whole army advanced. The French, still content to wait, just watched this happen. This may have been a mistake, but we will never know. The English regrouped at a new forward position and reconstructed their makeshift defenses. This new position put the French within the extreme range of the English longbow. Before too long, the French started to get pelted by a few arrows. The French were ordered to advance. The men on the front lines were immediately hit with unexpectedly heavy arrow fire, which caused some of the units to try to pull back, while others continued to advance. This caused a big mess, and the battle was only minutes old. The French cavalry was not discouraged, and charged heroically into the arrow fire. They headed straight for the English archers, who appeared to be in exposed positions. As they advanced, the English hit them with volley after volley, but soon enough the French reached the English line. The defensive wooden stakes did their job, and the first group of cavalry to reach the archers found themselves impaled on the spikes. Apparently this caused the horses further back to panic, and many of them now refused to charge the archers. There was some isolated hand-to-hand fighting, but for the most part, the cavalry just darted back and forth in front of the English longbowmen. After failing to regroup and mount a second charge, the French cavalry turned to withdraw. As they did this, chaos started to spread, and the withdrawal turned into a full-blown rout. All order broke down, and the French cavalry uncontrollably crashed into their own heavy infantry, causing general pandemonium. Still under fire, the French infantry from the first and second lines regrouped, and then advanced. Remember that the field was muddy, and it was now completely tore up after that failed cavalry charge. The infantry was weighed down in full armor, and had serious difficulty navigating in the mud. They advanced at a snail's pace, and the entire time the English longbowmen were doing their thing. When they finally reached the English line, they were totally exhausted, but nevertheless charged the English center. The French infantry still significantly outnumbered the English, and the English were forced to slowly give ground. As you can imagine, the English archers had a field day with the stationary French infantry at close range. Despite all of this punishment, the French troops continued to gain ground. This fighting continued for 3 hours, and it was intense. As the English longbowmen began to run out of arrows, they picked up swords and went to reinforce the heavy infantry. The English king personally intervened and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. He actually took an axe blow to the helmet. The English were fighting for their lives. After hours of brutal fighting, a couple of French units broke and pulled back. The English were on their toes and immediately poured into the gap in the French lines. The commanders of the French infantry were all dead. Leaderless, individual French units began to surrender to the English en masse. The remaining units broke and fled. The English now had thousands of prisoners, but still faced the uncommitted French third line. They sent out a messenger, saying something to the effect of "withdraw or be destroyed." The English then set about barbarically slaughtering thousands of their prisoners. Why did they do this? Maybe it was supposed to intimidate the remaining French. Maybe they didn't have enough men to guard the prisoners and fight at the same time. Maybe they were overcome with simple bloodlust. Regardless, the French third line got the message and quietly withdrew from the field. The battle was now over, and it was a stunning English victory. The French lost somewhere around 8,000 men. The English lost only 100. So what did this mean for world history? Why was this such a big turning point? This battle crystallized a couple of trends that would come to redefine European warfare. First, the rise of projectile weapons. Gunpowder was around, but its military usage was not yet fully realized. Agincourt gave us a peek at the world to come. Short bows, which were common before the 15th century, fired arrows that would bounce off of most heavy armor. Longbows, which the English used at Agincourt, had an extremely long range and had the power to punch through plate mail. This improvement in projectile weapons was a development that was going to continue, and would only become more pronounced with the widespread introduction of the flintlock musket some years later. Second, heavy armor just wasn't what it used to be. When heavy infantry couldn't move fast enough to engage with longbowmen or musketmen, they were transforming themselves into nothing more than slowly moving targets. Going forward, heavy infantry had to be paired with longbowmen or musketmen in order to be effective. Third, the death of the cavalry charge. Beginning with Agincourt, this could no longer be every army's trump card. Obviously, mounted troops would be widely used and situationally effective for centuries, but look at what happened here. The English turned a frontal attack into a rout and barely even had to come face to face with the enemy. This was new. Cavalry could not be relied on as an army's all-purpose sledgehammer anymore. Europe would spend the next couple of centuries adapting to this new paradigm.
And here, finally then, is the video of the St. Christmas Day speech that Henry V gave just before the Battle of Agincourt, and you can see why that might have been such a big deal to the people that were getting ready to go out and die. And then just became even more like awesome when those people actually survived after having wiped out the chivalry of France yet again.
Of fighting men, They have full 70,000.
That's 5 to 1. Besides, they are all fresh.
Tis a fearful odds.
Oh, that we now had here but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today.
What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day!
All right, it's time to finish off the 100 Years' War, thank God. So we're moving forward. The English had done a really good job regaining territory under Henry V, and we start moving forward into another group of people who get involved. There is a territory of France at the time known as Burgundy, just like the color, right? And so they're called the Burgundians that ruled there. The Burgundians were French, just like the Normans had been French. It's just that the Burgundians were so powerful that they didn't have to do everything the French king told them. And so the French king really wanted the Burgundians to like him and do what he said, but the Burgundians were almost like their own kingdom, okay? So the Burgundians, one of the most powerful families in France, and the king can't really push these guys around too much. And their allegiance to the English was a major reason that the French were losing, because the Burgundians, way over here, if you can see them, the Burgundians had more to gain by, can you see this? How much territory the English have gained by the time we get to the end of Henry V, right here? Look at all this territory. Paris is like right down here. This is bad for the French. They have lost a ton of territory, all right? So the deal is that Burgundy is this kind of end of France, and the Burgundians, they rule all this territory, and they're sort of allied with the English. And the question is will the Burgundians stay allied with the English? What's got to happen, right? And it's, again, it goes back to Game of Thrones stuff. It's really just a game of politics, and the Burgundians could switch sides from the English to the French anytime. And that might be something that happens, hint, hint. So there's a prime example here of feudal politics. France was not yet a unified nation because it had all these different families that were making deals on their own with enemies. So we have the Treaty of Troyes. And then in that treaty, 1420, the victorious Henry V is going to marry Catherine, a princess of France. When Henry V marries Catherine, they have an agreement between the nobility of France and England. And the Burgundians supported this, as did Flanders, which is that Henry's son, Henry and Catherine's son, I should say, would be the heir, would be the ruler of both the English and the French thrones. So a dual French and English monarch would now, just one person would now rule England and France and England could be this empire of its own making, and peace and prosperity would reign. Henry V has led England to a major victory that it's been trying to fight for since Edward III, several kings ago, almost 100 years before. The war is almost over. The lecture can finally end. We can all go get dinner or something. But in 1422, Henry V and King Charles VI, who was the king of France when all this happened, died the same year. 1422. Okay, so when that happens, the nobles of both sides start to wonder: is the agreement about there being a child, the child of Henry and Catherine, is that person still going to be the ruler of France, or what's going to happen? Because these guys aren't going to be there to enforce their treaty. Oh no! Here's the kid, Henry VI, and was declared the king of England and France. That's what was supposed to happen. He's a little child. He's a little kid. And he's declared the king of England and France, but these guys aren't there. They're not there to help him along. So all those crazy nobles are now going to start to wring their hands and wonder what they can do for power and glory. And France does this thing. The political stabilization is now destabilized. Charles VII was actually another English noble, the direct descendant of the earlier kings of France. And he's going to say, you know what, screw it. Although this little kid is supposed to be the king of France, I am really more legitimate. Before that last deal was made, this guy named Dauphin, the Dauphin is like a prince. So Charles VII, this other guy, says, I should be the king of France. I'm the one that should actually be ruling France, not this little kid whose parents have died, who was, through this treaty of Henry V in France, is going to be the next king. Screw that kid. I'm the king, he says in French. All right. So Charles VII decides that he's going to take over France, and, England and France go back to war. There's going to be this huge battle at a place called Orleans. All right. And this French town with a big castle in it has been under siege when the war renewed, when this guy named Charles VII says, I'm going to be the king. Okay. So French town under siege by a large English army, 6 months. It was believed by everybody that if Orleans, which was a very strategic and very important castle town, fortified town, fell, the English would gain another military victory that would force France to be ruled by England no matter what. And that's when our famous Joan of Arc finally shows up. It's this peasant girl who says that God talks to her in her dreams. She might have been a schizophrenic, to be honest with you. We don't know for sure. Either way, she says that God talked to her, and God told her that she was to lead a French army against the English, who were outside of the city of Orleans. Okay. The deal is, to make this story less long, is Joan of Arc does it. She actually raises an army of French who were looking for somebody to lead them because they knew they were about to lose their country to the invading English. And Joan of Arc is going to lead an army into almost complete victory against the English, except, and this is within 9 days, the English are driven away from Orleans, okay? So 1412 to 1432, that's when she's around. She doesn't live for long, all right? She does not have a very long life, but boy, does she have an impact on the Western world. She was a mystic, someone touched in the head, probably had schizophrenia, or she actually talked to God. It depends on who you are and what you think about this stuff. And because she reported these visions of divine revelation, people in France were not sure if she was a witch or if she was actually a instrument of God and therefore someone to be treated like a saint and followed. And her voices told her to go to the king and assist him in driving out the English. That's Charles VII, the French king. So she dresses like a man, serves as a source of tremendous inspiration for the French. Any other time, if a woman had tried this, she would have been tried as a witch and killed, or put into a monastery. But instead, she is upsetting the social order because the French need a hero. The French are in deep trouble here, and they need somebody to guide them because they've been losing almost this entire 100 Years' War. Well, in 1430, the Burgundians, always trying to cement a friendship with the English, those traitorous Burgundians, will capture Joan of Arc and deliver her to the English. The English are going to put her on trial, and they're going to burn her at the stake for kind of a dual charge of witchcraft and heresy. So she's burned at the stake, which means that the French automatically see her as a martyr because the English did something stupid here. They should have returned her after creating a new treaty, but instead the English set her on fire out of their righteous anger because she upset the siege of Orleans, and therefore they killed Joan of Arc, and Joan of Arc is now going to be turned into a patron saint, okay, of the French. Dang it all. And so there's a lot of myth around her, and a lot of images and paintings and stained glass windows of Joan of Arc as a result of the English turning her into a saint, okay, a martyr. Well, the French are going to continue fighting under the name of Joan of Arc after Joan is dead, and so they've been revived, all right? The French spirit against the English has been revived, and the French are going to start developing something called gunpowder weapons, which is going to be the first time we really see this weapon used in Europe, is going to be during this 100 Years' War, because the French are desperate enough to try it against the English. So by the mid-15th century, you've already seen some guns in the field, these kind of hand cannons, but you haven't seen a ton of big cannons being used against castles. So the deal is that the French are going to invest a ton of money in cannons to try to knock down English forts and castles. And the English have nothing to combat this. The English have been using their longbows. They don't know how to make cannons yet. All right. So the English, finally, as we get to the end of the war, are going to be up against French cannons. And the English cannot stop French cannons with longbows. That's just the way it is. So English held fortresses in France are no longer safe from French armies because the English can't hide behind their walls. So at the end of the war, finally, Joan becomes a national symbol. French forces continue to win. There's your map. The English hold on to a little piece of territory right here, and that's it, you guys. All right, the French have basically won the 100 Years' War at this point. So in 1435, as a result of France becoming a more unified nation under, the martyr of Joan and all this stuff, right? The Burgundians have to switch sides. And so the Burgundians are no longer with the English, who, the Burgundians who own all this land here. They now join Charles VI. Charles VI becomes a more legitimate king than he ever was before. And Charles VI now rules France, with the Burgundians throwing in their support because the Burgundians have nowhere else to go. The French have lost. They can no longer be pals the English have lost. The Burgundians can no longer be pals of the English. And by 1450, the English only held on to the city of Calais, which they're still going to have in World War I and II. 1453, the French will take small fortresses throughout the rest of the territory using cannons. And there's no peace treaty signed. Technically, France and England were still at war after this happened. It's just that, they were kind of tired at this point. There were other things to worry about. All right. So what that's going to lead us to, guys, here is your timeline of the various stages of the 100 Years' War. All right. So the start in 1337, where you have Edward III fighting it, and then his son for the last fight there, Edward IV. Then you have the fighting with the Black Prince and all that stuff right in here. That's the other Edward. And then you've got the Lancastrian War under Henry IV and Henry V fighting right in here. And you have the last battle of the war, 1453, when cannons took out the last remaining English fortresses in the south of France. So the deal is, ladies and gentlemen, is that's what this looks like. This is the deal, right? The war starts in 1337 with a very powerful France. You get a less powerful France and a more powerful England. You have a little bit of a blip here. And then, of course, that's the end. The end is that the English ultimately lose. After all that Henry V stuff and the Battle of Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, the English ultimately lose. And that leads us to the legacy. What began as a feudal and dynastic struggle between two monarchs ended as a national conflict between these two nations. And at the end of it, England was weaker and inferior to a new and modernized France, a France with cannons. And what's going to happen is people need to blame somebody for this. The English people need to blame somebody for having lost the 100 Years' War. And so England is going to devolve into civil war for a while. And England is no longer going to be a problem for France for quite a while as the War of the Roses breaks out, the war between the Lancastrians and the York families of England who try to fight each other for rule of England. And eventually the Tudors will show up in there as well, which will lead us to the Elizabethan age, okay? So ladies and gentlemen, next week we will get into the War of the Roses, which is what the Game of Thrones is actually based on. It's a fantasy story based on the idea of the War of the Roses in England, according to the author J.R.R. Martin. And we'll have some fun with that next week, all right? Thanks a lot, you guys. It's been fun. We'll end with that slide.